The winter my husband's brother showed up to fix my furnace, I learned that some kinds of cold have nothing to do with the weather. I hadn't called him. That's the part nobody believes when I tell the story. I would never have called Ethan Shaw, not because I disliked him. The opposite, if I'm honest, and that was exactly the problem. I would never have called him because he was my dead husband's little brother, and there are lines a decent widow does not walk up to, let alone cross. My name is Claire Shaw. I was 39, widowed for 11 months, and living alone in the drafty farmhouse my husband Michael and I had bought 3 winters before he died. Michael had been the one who understood the house, its moods, its bad plumbing, the furnace that groaned like an old dog and needed talking to as much as fixing. When he died, the house stopped making sense to me. It became a machine I didn't have the manual for. Michael went the way strong men sometimes go, fast and without asking permission, a heart attack at 42 on an ordinary Tuesday in the driveway, with the truck still running. No long goodbye. No time to learn where he kept the shut-off valve or how he coaxed the furnace back to life. Just a phone call at work, a drive to the hospital that I don't remember making, and then 11 months of being a woman who used to be a wife. His family circled tight for the first month. They always do. Casseroles, phone calls, his mother arriving with her grief like a second suitcase she needed help carrying. Then, one by one, they went back to their lives, and I don't blame them for that. Grief has a shelf life for everyone except the person standing in the cold kitchen. Everyone except Ethan. Ethan was 3 years younger than Michael, a quieter version of him. Same broad shoulders, same careful hands, but where Michael filled a room, Ethan watched it. He ran a small heating and cooling business 2 towns over, the kind of work that meant he was always the one the family called when something broke. At Michael's funeral, while the rest of them recited the polite things people recite, Ethan had knelt down in front of me, taken both my frozen hands in his warm ones, and said only, he'd want the house looked after. Let me be the one who does that. Don't argue. I remember thinking, even in the fog of that day, that it was such an Ethan thing to say. No speech about heaven, no promise that time would heal, just a practical offer, delivered like a man volunteering for a shift nobody else wanted. That was how the Shaw brothers loved people, not with words, but with work. Michael had loved me by fixing the house. Ethan was offering to love me the only way he knew how, which was to keep the house Michael had loved from falling down around me. I argued anyway. For 11 months, I argued. Every time something broke, the water heater, a window seal, the gutter that came down in an October wind, I paid a stranger to fix it rather than call Ethan, because calling Ethan felt like admitting something I wasn't ready to say out loud. I told myself it was about independence, about not leaning on Michael's family. But the truth I kept in the same locked room as everything else, was that I was afraid of what would happen if Ethan Shaw spent an afternoon in my house. I was afraid of exactly what did happen. I think some part of me had always been afraid of it. I think that's why I'd been so careful for 9 years to never once be alone in a room with my husband's brother for longer than it took to hand him a beer. Then the furnace died. In January. In a cold snap that dropped the whole valley to single digits. I did everything right. I called 2 companies. One couldn't come for a week. The other quoted me a number that sounded like a car payment. I put on Michael's old flannel and 2 pairs of socks and told myself I could last until the appointment. I could not. By the second night I could see my breath in the bedroom, and the pipes were making the sound that pipes make right before they do something expensive, so I broke. Not to Ethan. I want that on the record. I texted Michael's mother to ask if she knew a cheaper repairman. She must have called Ethan the second she put down the phone. Because at 7 the next morning, before I'd even had coffee, there was a truck in my driveway. His truck. And Ethan Shaw was standing on my porch in a canvas work coat with frost in his dark hair and a toolbox in one hand, looking at me through the storm door like a man who already knew I was going to protest. "Don't," he said, before I could open my mouth. Your mother-in-law called me. You've been in this house with no heat for 2 days in January. I'm not leaving. So you can let me in, or you can watch me pick the lock on Michael's own back door, and we both know I know where he hid the key. I let him in. I told myself it was just the furnace, just a broken furnace, a cold house, and a man who happened to know how to fix it. Nothing complicated. Nothing that should have made me change out of Michael's flannel and put on something that fit before I opened the door. I should have known better. Michael used to say I only ever bundled up when I was trying to hide how I really felt. He was right about that too. The furnace was in the basement, and the basement was Michael's territory more than any other room in the house. His workbench still had a project on it, a birdhouse he'd been building for my birthday, half finished, that I hadn't been able to touch. His coat still hung on the nail by the stairs. Ethan saw all of it the second he came down. I watched him see it. He didn't say anything about the coat. He just set his toolbox down, crouched in front of the furnace, and started talking to it the exact way his brother used to. "All right, you old bear," he murmured, pulling the access panel. "What's got you sulking?" Something in my chest cracked clean in half. I had to go back up the stairs. I stood in my cold kitchen with my hands around a mug of coffee I couldn't taste and listened to the sounds coming up through the floor. The clink of tools, the low mutter of a man coaxing a machine, the same rhythm the house used to have when it still had a husband in it. I hadn't heard that rhythm in 11 months. I hadn't known how much I'd been missing it until it came back up through the floorboards. Ethan worked for 2 hours. Every so often he'd come up for a part from his truck, stamp the cold off his boots, and give me a report I only half understood. A cracked heat exchanger, a seized blower motor, the diagnosis of a house that had been quietly falling apart while I wasn't looking. Around the 90-minute mark he called up the stairs. "Claire? Come here a second. I want to show you something." I went down. He'd pulled the furnace apart further than I'd ever seen it, and he pointed a flashlight at a small panel inside. There, in faded pencil on the metal, was a date and 2 sets of initials. MS, 1019. Michael's handwriting. His annual October service logged the way his father had taught him, the way Ethan's father had taught them both. "He did this every year," Ethan said quietly. "Wrote the date so the next guy would know. Dad taught us both to do it. It's a small thing, but it means somebody cared enough to keep a record. Somebody was paying attention." He looked at the faded initials for a moment. "Last entries from the October before he died. Nobody's written in it since. This furnace has been running on the last bit of care my brother gave it for a year and a half until it finally gave out." I stared at my dead husband's handwriting inside the machine that had kept me alive, and I couldn't speak. Ethan took a pencil from behind his ear. He wrote under Michael's last entry in his own careful block letters, ES, 114. Then he handed me the pencil. "Your turn next October," he said. "I'll show you how. It's not hard. It's just paying attention. That's most of what keeping a house alive is." He closed the panel gently, like he was tucking something in. "You shouldn't have to depend on me forever. You should know how to keep yourself warm." I held that pencil like it was made of gold. It was, I think, the exact moment I stopped grieving quite so hard and started, without permission, to hope. "It's fixable," he said finally, wiping his hands on a rag. "Today. But Claire, this furnace should have been serviced last fall. Michael always did it in October." He looked at me carefully. "Nobody's been taking care of the house, have they? I've been paying people. You've been paying strangers to patch what breaks. That's not the same as taking care of it." He said it gently, but it landed hard. There's a difference between keeping a house standing and keeping it alive. I looked at Michael's coat on the nail. "I don't know how to keep it alive," I said, and my voice came out smaller than I meant it to. "That was his job. I've just been surviving inside it." Ethan was quiet for a moment. Then he crouched back down at the furnace, gave the ignition one last adjustment, and it caught with a low, familiar roar. Warm air moved through the vents for the first time in 2 days. I felt it touch my ankles like something coming back to life. "There," he said, standing. "She'll run now." And then he looked at me. At the flannel and socks, at the untouched birdhouse on the workbench, at the breath that wasn't fogging in the air anymore. And he said the thing. "Nobody should be this cold," Ethan said quietly. "Least of all you." I froze with the mug halfway to my lips. It wasn't improper. It wasn't even bold. It was a simple thing to say to a woman whose furnace had just been fixed. Domestic. Almost innocent. But the way he said it, not as a repairman reporting a job done, but as a man who had watched me freeze in more ways than one for 11 months and finally couldn't stand it, made the warm basement feel warmer still, like he wasn't only talking about the house. I set the mug down. "Ethan." "I know," he said. "I know, I shouldn't have said it like that." He picked up his toolbox too quickly. "I'll write up the invoice. Family rate. Don't argue about that either." There it was. The line decent people draw right after they've said something they meant too much. I should have let him leave. I should have thanked him, paid the invoice, and gone back to surviving inside my cold house. Instead, I said, "Stay for breakfast. It's the least I can do. You've been here since 7 and you haven't eaten." Ethan stopped on the bottom stair. He didn't turn around right away. "That's a bad idea," he said. "Probably," I agreed. "Stay anyway." He turned around, and the look on his face, careful, guarded, a little afraid of himself, was the first thing that made me wonder if the furnace was the only thing in that house that had been cold too long. Breakfast should not have felt like anything. It was eggs and toast, and the good coffee I'd stopped making for just myself. But I set 2 places at the kitchen table instead of eating standing at the counter the way I had every morning for 11 months. That mattered. The table was where Michael and I had sat every day of our marriage. I'd stopped using it after he died. It felt too big, too full of a missing person. Setting a second place for Ethan felt like unlocking a room I'd sealed shut. He washed up at the sink while I cooked, and the sound of a man moving around my kitchen was so achingly familiar that I had to keep my back to him for a minute. "You didn't have to cook," he said. "I know." "You keep saying that. It keeps being true." I put the plates down. "Sit. Before it gets cold. Everything in this house gets cold if you give it half a chance." We ate. For a while we talked about safe things. His business, the weather, his mother's endless campaign to get everyone to Sunday dinner. Then he got quiet, turning his fork over the way Michael used to, and I braced myself. "Can I say something?" Ethan said. "That might make this the last breakfast you ever invite me to? Given that you threatened to pick my lock this morning, I feel like we're past formalities." That got a real laugh out of him. Then it faded. "I've stayed away on purpose," he said, "for 11 months. You probably noticed. Everyone else called and visited, and you had to manage all their grief on top of your own, and I just sent the occasional text and stayed out of your house." He looked at his plate. "You want to know why?" "You didn't want to see the birdhouse," I said. "The unfinished one." "I understand. I can't look at it either." "That's part of it." He met my eyes. "The other part is that I've been half in love with you since the day my brother introduced us, and I have spent 9 years and 1 funeral being the most careful man alive so that you would never, ever have to know that." The kitchen went completely silent. The furnace hummed in the floor beneath us, warm now, steady. "Ethan," I whispered. "I'm not asking you for anything," he said quickly. "God, I need you to hear that. You just lost him. He was my brother. There is no version of this where I'm not crossing a line just by saying it out loud. I know that." His jaw tightened. "But I sat in my truck this morning in your driveway for 10 minutes before I knocked, because I knew if I came in here and fixed that furnace and watched you shiver in his old shirt, I wasn't going to be able to keep pretending anymore. And I was right. I couldn't. I'm sorry." I didn't say anything. I couldn't. Because the terrible, disloyal, undeniable truth was that some frozen part of me had just felt the first warmth in 11 months, and it wasn't coming from the furnace. "Michael knew," I said finally. Ethan went very still. "What?" "He knew. Your brother." My eyes were burning now. "He told me once, years ago, laughing. He said, 'My brother looks at you like you hung the moon, and he thinks nobody notices.' He wasn't jealous. He thought it was sweet. He said," my voice broke, he said, "if anything ever happens to me, Ethan's the only one I'd trust to make sure you're okay." Ethan's face did something complicated. Grief and disbelief and a hope he clearly hated himself for feeling. "He said that," he said. "He said that. I'd forgotten it until this exact second. I'd buried it with everything else." I wiped my eyes with the back of my hand. "I don't know what to do with it, Ethan. I don't know what any of this is. I only know that this is the warmest I've felt since the driveway, and I don't know if that makes me a widow who's healing or a wife who's betraying a dead man." Ethan reached across the table. He didn't take my hand. He just laid his own down near it, on the wood, close enough that I'd know it was there if I wanted it. "You're not betraying anyone," he said, "but we're not going to figure out which one it is over eggs, so don't rush it. There's no clock on this. The furnace is fixed. The house is warm. That's all today has to be." "That's very reasonable," I said, "for a man who just told me he's been in love with me for 9 years. I'm a very reasonable man. It's my worst quality." A ghost of a smile. "Michael got all the impulsiveness. I got all the restraint. We used to joke that between the two of us, we made one functional person." The smile faded. "He'd hate how careful I'm being right now, you know. He'd have told me to stop hedging and just say the thing. He never understood why I waited on anything." "Why do you?" I asked. "Wait on things." Ethan considered it honestly, the way he considered everything. "Because when you want something as much as I've wanted this," he said quietly, "rushing it feels like the fastest way to break it. Michael grabbed at life with both hands, and it worked for him, right up until the morning it didn't. I always figured, if I ever got something this good, I'd rather deserve it slow than lose it fast." He looked at his own hand on the table, close to mine. "So no, I'm not going to rush you. You can take a year, you can take 5. The furnace runs either way. I'll service it every October, whether you ever hold my hand or not, because that's what Michael would want, and because it's what I'd want, even if he'd never existed." I looked at this man, his brother's face and not his brother at all, his brother's careful hands and his own patient heart, and I felt the frozen thing in my chest shift, just slightly, like a river remembering how to move under ice. I looked at his hand near mine, and I didn't move mine away, but I didn't take it either. Not yet. Some things you don't rush. He left that morning without either of us saying anything more. It was the right thing. I hated how right it felt. But an hour after his truck pulled out of the driveway, my phone buzzed, a text from Ethan. I shouldn't have said all that. "But I'm not sorry the house is warm. Take care of yourself, Claire. Actually take care, not survive." I read it 4 times. Then a second message came through, and for what it's worth, Michael was right about me, about all of it. I'm sorry it took a broken furnace to say so. I stood in my newly warm kitchen, in the house I didn't have the manual for, and I realized I was holding the phone against my chest, like it could keep me from coming apart. The first time it happened in public was at the hardware store, of all places. I'd gone in for furnace filters. Ethan had told me which ones, had made me promise to change them monthly, and I'd found I actually liked the small ritual of it, this tiny act of keeping the house alive instead of just standing. The man behind the counter was named Roy, a friend of Michael's from the volunteer fire department, the kind of man who'd carried a corner of my husband's casket 11 months before. Roy rang up my filters and then leaned across the counter with the particular expression of a man about to say something he thinks is kind. "How you holding up, Claire? We worry about you out there in that big house." Then, before I could answer, his face shifted into something knowing. "Though I hear you've got the Shaw boy coming around to help out, Ethan," he said the name carefully. "That's good. Family looking after family." "He fixed my furnace," I said, in the cold snap. Sure. Roy nodded, but he held my eyes a beat too long, and then he said the thing everyone was thinking and only he was foolish enough to say to my face. "Funny thing, Grief. Michael's not gone a year, and his brother's already, well." He smiled like we were sharing something. "Some folks'd say that's fast." The store went very quiet. There were 2 other customers in the aisle. I watched them stop, pretending not to listen. I could have laughed it off. That would have been the easy thing, the thing I'd done for 11 months, letting the joke land so nobody had to feel its sharp edge, making myself small so everyone else's comfort had room. Instead, I set the filters down on the counter, slow, and I looked at Roy. "Roy," I said, "you carried my husband's casket. I'll thank you for that until the day I die. So I'm going to tell you something one time, because you were his friend. Ethan Shaw drove to my house at 7 in the morning in single-digit cold. On a day he had paying jobs lined up, and he fixed my dead furnace and charged me nothing, not $1. I'd been sleeping in my coat for 2 nights. I could see my breath in my own bedroom." My voice stayed level. "And the man you're winking about, the man you're reducing to a joke about how fast grief moves, is the only person in this county who noticed I was freezing and did something about it instead of asking how I was holding up and then driving home to his warm house." Roy's face had gone red. The aisle had gone silent. "So the next time you want to be clever about a widow warming up," I said, picking my filters back up, "you remember that the man you're mocking kept me alive this winter, while the rest of you sent thoughts and prayers. There's nothing funny about being warm, Roy, least of all for me." I paid and walked out, hands shaking, head up the whole way to the truck, and it was only when I got there that I realized I'd used Ethan's words without meaning to. His warmth had become mine somewhere along the way. Roy called 2 days later and apologized properly, sober, ashamed, saying Michael would have knocked his teeth out for it, which was true. I forgave him, but the story of me standing up in the hardware store traveled that county faster than any furnace could heat a house, and I found I didn't mind. Let them talk. I was done being cold, and I was done being small. For 3 weeks we did it right, and it was the hardest thing I'd done since the funeral. We texted, but carefully. He'd ask if the furnace was still running clean. I'd tell him yes and ask about his business. Practical things with whole winters underneath them. Once he sent a photo of a service call, an ancient furnace held together with what looked like hope and duct tape. Captioned, "This one talks back. Thought of you." I laughed out loud alone in my kitchen, and then felt guilty for laughing, and then got angry at myself for feeling guilty, which is the whole cycle of grief in about 4 seconds. I should tell you about the insurance money, because if I don't, what Diane did later makes less sense. When Michael died, there was a life insurance policy, not a fortune, but enough. Enough to pay off the farmhouse, enough that I never had to worry about the mortgage on top of everything else I was drowning in. Michael had been meticulous about it. He'd set it up the first year we were married, back when we had nothing, because that was the kind of man he was. He planned for the worst, so I'd never have to face it unprotected. What I didn't know, for 11 months, was that Diane believed part of that money should have gone to the family. I found out from Grace, Michael's sister, who called me one afternoon in the middle of those careful 3 weeks with Ethan, sounding miserable. "Claire, I have to tell you something because it's going to come out, and I don't want you blindsided," Grace said. "Mom's been talking to a lawyer about Michael's estate." The kitchen went cold in a way the furnace couldn't touch. What does that mean, a lawyer? She thinks, Grace exhaled, she thinks the house should have some kind of family claim on it. Because it was Michael's. Because he grew up in this county. Because the down payment came partly from Dad's old workshop money when he passed. She's got it in her head that if you were to move on, remarry, whatever, that the house would leave the family, go to a stranger, and she can't stand that idea. I sat down at the table. Michael's card was still in the basement then. I hadn't found it yet. I had nothing to hold on to but the truth as I understood it, which suddenly felt very thin. Grace, the house is in my name. Michael put it in both our names when we bought it, and it came to me when he died. That's not a family claim. That's just how marriage works. I know that. You know that. Any lawyer knows that. Grace's voice dropped. But Claire, she's grieving and she's angry and she's found a target, and the target is you being warm again while her son is cold in the ground. The lawyer thing isn't really about the house. It's about punishment. It's her way of saying you don't get to be happy on Michael's dime. And Ethan, I asked because I had to. Does she think Ethan's after the house too? Is that what this is? She thinks he's, what, courting the widow to keep the property in the family? Grace was quiet for a long, awful moment. She said something like that, Grace admitted. Not to me directly, to Aunt Ruth. She said, a pause, she said, that's why he's suddenly so eager to be over there, fixing things. I'm sorry, Claire. I told her she was being cruel and paranoid, but you should know that's the story she's building. I hung up and I sat in my warm kitchen and I let the poison do exactly what it had traveled all that way to do. Because that was the splinter under the splinter, wasn't it? Not just is it too soon, not just does it dishonor Michael, but the worst one, the one that made my stomach turn. What if Ethan isn't who I think he is? What if the warmth I'd felt for the first time in 11 months was a story someone was telling me for the price of a farmhouse? I didn't call Ethan that night. I couldn't. Instead, I did the thing grief and suspicion make you do. I went looking for evidence to convict a good man because it felt safer than being a fool. I found the invoice from the furnace repair, the one he'd threatened to charge me family rate for. I'd never actually looked at the number because I'd been too busy being undone by the whole morning. The invoice was for $0. He'd written across the bottom, in his careful block handwriting, parts on me, labor on me. This one's for Michael. Don't argue. $800 of furnace parts minimum, a morning of his labor. His actual livelihood, the thing his business ran on. Given for free to the woman his mother thought he was pursuing to steal a house. I called him then. It was late. He answered on the second ring, the way he always did. Claire, is the furnace okay? The furnace is fine, I said, and my voice was shaking. Ethan, your mother's talking to a lawyer about the house. She thinks, Grace says she thinks, that you're coming around here fixing things because you want to keep the property in the family. That this is about the house. The silence on the line was total. I need you to tell me the truth, I said. And I'll know if you're lying, because Michael could never lie to me and you sound exactly like him. Is any part of this about the house? Any part at all? When Ethan finally spoke, his voice was very quiet and very hard. Claire, I charged you nothing for that furnace. You know that, because you're holding the invoice, because that's why you're calling me at 11 at night. I gave you $800 in parts and a day of the work my whole business depends on, and I'd have done it if you lived in a cardboard box under a bridge with no house to inherit at all. A breath. I don't want Michael's house. I don't want $1 of Michael's money. If it would make this easier, I would sign a paper tomorrow saying I renounce any claim to any of it for the rest of my life, and I'd sign it happy, because the only thing in that house I have ever wanted is the woman, standing in the kitchen. And if my own mother has turned that into a story about property, then she doesn't know me at all, and it breaks my heart, but it doesn't change one thing about how I feel about you." I was crying by then. "I'm sorry," I said. "I'm sorry I even asked. I hate that I asked." "Don't be sorry. You'd be a fool not to ask, and you're no fool." His voice gentled. "You just lost him. You're being handed something that looks too good and too soon by a family that's grieving and looking for someone to blame. Of course you checked. I'd have checked too." A pause. "But now you've checked. So what does the invoice say I am?" I looked down at it. "Parts on me, labor on me. This one's for Michael." "It says you're exactly who I thought you were," I whispered. "Then believe the invoice," he said, "and stop believing my mother's lawyer." The next morning I called Diane's lawyer myself. Grace gave me the number, and I told him pleasantly that the house was in my name free and clear, that any claim was baseless, and that if Diane wanted to keep paying him by the hour to be told that, she was welcome to, but I'd be spending my energy elsewhere. He was gracious about it. Lawyers usually are, when you take away their leverage before they can use it. Diane never got the lawsuit she'd threatened, because there was no lawsuit to be had. But the accusation had done its work, and it hung between me and Michael's family like frost on a window, right up until the Sunday everything broke open. I'll get to that. I just needed you to know that when Diane pulled into my driveway with her rehearsed disappointment, it wasn't the first shot she'd fired. It was the last one. She'd already tried money. When money failed, she came in person, with Michael's sister as backup to try shame. She should have quit while she was behind. But first, before the Sunday before the lawyer, before I found the card, Michael's mother called. Her name was Diane, and Diane Shaw had buried a son 11 months ago and was not, it turned out, prepared to watch anything move in her family without her permission. "I hear Ethan's been to your house," she said. No hello. Diane never wasted a hello on bad news. "He fixed the furnace, Diane. It died in the cold snap. You gave him my message. I gave him your message so he'd recommend a repairman. Not so he'd spend the morning having breakfast with my son's widow." Her voice was tight. "People talk, Claire. They're already talking. Do you understand how it looks? 11 months. My Michael's been gone 11 months, and his brother fixed my furnace so I wouldn't freeze. Don't be naive. I've seen how that boy looks at you. I've seen it for years. I held my tongue while Michael was alive because there was nothing to say. But now," a sharp breath, "now it looks like the two of you couldn't even wait a year. It looks like he was waiting." The word waiting hung on the line like something rotten. "I have to go, Diane," I said quietly, and I hung up before she could hear my voice break. I didn't call Ethan. I sat in my warm kitchen and stared at Michael's coat on the basement nail through the open door, and I let his mother's words do what she'd sent them to do. Because the horrible thing about cruel accusations is that they always contain a splinter of the thing you're most afraid is true. Had Ethan been waiting? Had I? That night, I did something I hadn't done in 11 months. I went down to the basement, and I sat on the stool at Michael's workbench, and I picked up the unfinished birdhouse, and tucked underneath it, where I'd never looked, was a folded piece of paper with my name on it in my husband's handwriting. I want to tell you I opened it right away. I didn't. I sat there holding it for a long time, terrified of what a dead man had to say to me, more terrified of how much I wanted it to say the thing I needed. It was a birthday card. He'd been building the birdhouse for my birthday, and he'd written the card early, the way organized people do, and then he'd died in the driveway with the truck running and never given me either one. "Claire," it said, "happy birthday, my love. I built you a place for small things to come home to. That's all I've ever wanted to be for you, the place you come home to. If I'm slow finishing this, it's because I want it to be perfect and you're worth taking time over. Love always, M." I don't know how long I cried on that basement stool. Long enough that the furnace cycled on and off 3 times, warm air moving around me the whole while. The house Ethan had brought back to life, keeping me company while I grieved the man who'd left it to me. I sat there in Michael's territory, his workbench, his coat on the nail, the half-built birdhouse, the card, and I let myself do the thing I'd been too afraid to do for 11 months. I talked to him. Out loud in the warm basement, like a woman who'd lost her mind, which maybe I had. "I don't know what to do," I told the empty room. "Your brother's in love with me. He's been in love with me for years, and he never said a word while you were alive because he's the most decent man I've ever met, except for you. And I think, Michael, I think I might feel it back, and I don't know if that makes me a widow who's healing, or a wife who's betraying you. And you're the only person who could tell me, and you're not here." My voice cracked. "You left me a house I don't understand, and a furnace I can't fix, and a life I don't have the manual for. And then you sent your brother to keep it all running, and I don't know if that was an accident or the last kind thing you ever did for me." The furnace clicked on. Warm air moved across the floor and touched my feet, and I looked down at the card in my hands, "The place you come home to." And I understood that it hadn't been an accident. None of it. Michael had planned for the worst his whole life, so I'd never face it unprotected. The insurance, the house in both our names, and Ethan's the only one I'd trust to make sure you're okay. He'd been arranging my warmth from the moment he married me, and he'd kept arranging it right up until the driveway, and past it. And somewhere in there, the splinter Diane had driven in worked its way back out. Because I understood, holding that card, that Michael had never been afraid of me being loved. He'd spent his whole life trying to make sure I would be. He'd said it to me directly. "Ethan's the only one I'd trust." He'd built me a place for small things to come home to, and then trusted the people who loved me to keep the porch light on after he was gone. Diane was protecting a story. Michael had been protecting me. Those were not the same thing, and I had been letting the wrong one win. I picked up my phone. It was almost midnight. I texted Ethan one line: "Come for dinner Sunday. The front way. Park in the driveway. Let them see the truck." He wrote back in under a minute: "Are you sure?" I looked at the card in my hand, and Michael's coat on the nail, and the vents breathing warm air into a house that had finally stopped being a tomb. "I've never been more sure of anything," I wrote. "And Ethan, I'm done being cold." Sunday, Ethan parked in the driveway in daylight, and I met him on the porch, and I had just let myself believe the hard part was over when a second car pulled in behind his. Diane. She got out slowly, in her church coat, with the expression of a woman who had rehearsed her disappointment on the whole drive over. Behind her, from the passenger seat, came Michael's older sister, Grace, recruited clearly for reinforcement. "So it's true," Diane said, looking at Ethan's truck like it was evidence at a trial. "You didn't even try to hide it." "There's nothing to hide, Mom," Ethan said, moving to stand beside me. Not in front of me, beside me. I noticed that. So did Diane. 11 months. Diane's voice shook. "My son has been in the ground 11 months, and the two of you are having Sunday dinner like he was never here," I said. The words came out steadier than I felt. Everyone turned to look at me, and I understood, standing on that porch in the cold, that this was the moment. Not the furnace, not the breakfast, not the card in the basement. This. The moment where my husband's mother stood in my driveway and expected me to shrink, to apologize, to make her grief more comfortable by making myself smaller. I'd been doing that for 11 months, making myself small so everyone else's grief had room. "Come inside, Diane," I said, "all of you, because I have something of Michael's that you need to see, and I'm not going to have this conversation in the cold. I'm done having anything in the cold." I sat them at the kitchen table, and the table I'd stopped using, the one Ethan had gotten me to set a second place at 3 weeks before. I put the birdhouse in the center of it, and I put Michael's card unfolded beside it. "Read it," I told Diane, out loud. He wrote it for my birthday. He died before he could give it to me. I found it in the basement 4 nights ago, under the birdhouse he was building me, and I have read it about 200 times since, so I already know it by heart. But you should hear it in his words. Diane's hands trembled as she picked up the card. She read it out loud, and her voice broke on the same line mine always broke on. The place you come home to. When she finished, the kitchen was silent, except for the furnace, humming warm beneath us all. You raised a good man, I said quietly. The best man I ever knew. And you know what he told me years ago, laughing because he thought it was sweet and not sad? He told me that if anything ever happened to him, Ethan was the only person on this earth he'd trust to make sure I was okay. I looked at Diane. Your son wasn't afraid of me being loved after he was gone, Diane. He arranged for it. He practically wrote it into the will of his own heart. The only person in this family who thinks loving me would betray Michael is you. And it's not because of Michael. It's because if I'm warm again, you have to put down the anger, and the anger is the last thing you've got that still feels like holding him. Diane made a sound. Not a word. A break. The sound of a story a person has been clutching for 11 months, finally slipping out of her hands. Grace, the sister, was crying openly now, and Ethan reached over and put his hand flat on the table near mine, the same as he had 3 weeks before. This time I took it, in front of his mother, in front of all of them. In the warm kitchen, at the full table, under the roof his brother had loved. Diane looked at our joined hands for a long moment. Then she looked at the card. Then, to my complete astonishment, she reached out and touched the unfinished birdhouse with one shaking finger. He always took too long finishing things, she whispered. Wanted them perfect. A tear slid down. He'd have wanted this finished too, wouldn't he? Not left in the cold. Yeah, Ethan said, his voice rough. He would have, Mum. It wasn't forgiveness, not all the way. Grief doesn't resolve in one kitchen, but it was a door, coming unstuck. Diane wiped her eyes with the back of her hand. Michael's gesture, the whole family had it, and she said in the smallest voice I'd ever heard from her, the dinner's getting cold. And we ate. All of us. At the full table in the warm house, the empty chair at the head of it feeling for the first time in 11 months, not like a wound, but like a blessing. We took it slow after that, painfully slow. We were both old enough and grieved enough to know that loneliness can disguise itself as love, and we wanted to be certain it was the real thing. Ethan finished the birdhouse. It took him a month. He wanted it perfect, and I let him, because I understood now that some things you don't rush. We hung it in the oak tree outside the kitchen window, and the following spring a pair of wrens moved in, and the first morning I saw them carrying twigs through the little door. I had to sit down at the table because Michael's card was suddenly the truest thing in the world, a place for small things to come home to. The building of us happened in small pieces, the way real things do. There was the first time Ethan stayed the night, and I woke before dawn, reaching for the wrong side of the bed, for a body that wasn't there and would never be there again, and the low animal grief of that hit me so hard I had to go sit in the bathroom on the cold floor. Ethan found me there 20 minutes later. He didn't try to fix it. He didn't tell me it was okay. He just sat down on the cold tile next to me in the dark and said, "You miss him. I miss him too. He was my brother before he was your husband. We're allowed to miss him in the same house at the same time." And we did. We sat there and missed Michael together until the sun came up, and that was the morning I stopped being afraid that loving Ethan meant erasing Michael. It didn't. It never had. Ethan was the only man alive who could grieve my husband right beside me, because he'd lost him too. There was the Sunday Diane came for dinner and brought Michael's old toolbox, his actual toolbox, the good one that she'd taken from the basement after the funeral because she couldn't bear to leave it in the house. She set it on the kitchen table without a word and pushed it toward Ethan. "He'd want you to have these," she said gruffly. "You're the only one who'd use them right." Then, to me, even more gruffly, "And you keep the birdhouse." Obviously. It was the closest thing to a blessing Diane Shaw had in her, and we all knew it, and I had to leave the room for a minute. There was the night the power went out in an ice storm. Of course it was an ice storm. And the furnace went dark with it, and instead of panicking, I just watched Ethan light the old kerosene heater Michael had kept in the basement, the one I'd never known how to use, and I realized I would never again be a woman freezing alone in a house she didn't understand. We spent that whole black freezing night under every blanket we owned, telling Michael stories by the light of the heater. The time he'd tried to fix the furnace himself in year 1 and nearly gassed us both out of the house. The way he talked to machines. The birthday he forgot until 9 p.m. and then drove 2 towns over to buy me flowers from a gas station and presented them like they were roses from Paris. We laughed so hard that night that we forgot to be cold, and I understood we'd found the thing almost nobody finds after a loss like this, a way to keep the person alive in the room, funnier and more real in the retelling instead of sealed behind glass. Diane came around in her way. She never fully lost the church lady wince, but she started setting a place for Ethan and me both at Sunday dinner. And once, about 4 months in, she caught me looking at Michael's photo on the mantel and came to stand beside me and said gruffly, he'd be glad it was Ethan, he'd have picked Ethan himself. Then she walked off before either of us could cry about it, which was the most Diane thing she could have done. The house came back to life. Ethan serviced the furnace every October, the way his brother used to, talking to it like an old bear. He knew where the shut-off valve was. He knew how to keep a house alive and not just standing. Slowly he taught me too, and slowly the farmhouse stopped being a machine I didn't have the manual for and became, again, a home. 2 years after the furnace died in the cold snap, Ethan asked me to marry him in that same basement, standing in front of the furnace, holding the ring in a hand still a little dirty from a service call. "I don't want to be the man who fixed your furnace one winter," he said. "I want to be the man who keeps you warm the rest of them." I cried. Then I laughed. Then I said, "That is the least romantic and most perfect thing anyone has ever said to me." "Is that a yes?" "It's a yes." I wiped my eyes. But for the record, I knew the morning of the eggs. I just needed to find Michael's card to give myself permission. "I know," Ethan said softly. "I was waiting for you to catch up. I've always been good at waiting." We kept the wedding small. My idea. I'd had the big one with Michael. 300 people, a barn, a band, a day so full of joy I'd never imagined it could end. I didn't want to compete with that memory or replace it. I wanted the opposite of it in every way, except the one that mattered. So there were maybe 30 people in the backyard, folding chairs from the church, string lights Ethan hung between the porch and the oak, and a furnace running warm in the basement below us on a summer day. It didn't need to because I asked him to turn it on anyway, for luck, for the joke of it, for the truth of it. We married under the oak tree with the birdhouse in it, with Diane crying loudly in the front row and blaming it on the pollen. Michael was everywhere that day, in his brother's careful hands, in the toolbox Diane had given back, in the ring on my right hand, in the birdhouse full of wrens above our heads. And it didn't hurt the way I'd once assumed it would. His presence at my second wedding wasn't a ghost at the feast. It was a blessing I could finally feel. Halfway through the reception, I found Diane standing alone by the oak, looking up at the birdhouse. "He'd have finished it faster," she said, not turning around. "Michael, he was slow, but he wasn't that slow." A pause. "Ethan took a whole month on it." "Ethan wanted it perfect," I said. "He said I was worth taking time over." Diane was quiet a moment. Then, "That's word for word what Michael wrote in that card." Her voice wavered. "I've been thinking about that. How both my boys said the same thing about the same woman. Maybe I raised them better than I've been acting. She finally turned to me, her eyes wet. I was wrong, Claire. I spent a year being angry at the two people who loved my son most, because I couldn't stand that life was moving and he wasn't in it. That was cruel of me, and Michael would be ashamed of me for it. Then put it down, I said gently. You told me grief has to have somewhere to go. Let this be where it goes, not the anger, this. I nodded at the yard, the lights, the family, the wrens carrying twigs through a little wooden door. He'd want you warm too, Diane. Diane looked at me for a long moment. Then she reached out and squeezed my hand, the same gesture, the whole family had it. And she said, he'd have said finally, about all of it, finally. Then she let go, wiped her eyes, blamed the pollen again, and went to stop the neighbor's dog from eating the cake, which was made from Michael's grandmother's recipe, because some warmth you carry forward on purpose. I wore Michael's grandmother's ring on my right hand and Ethan's on my left, and nobody in that family thought it was strange, because we had all learned the same thing in the same cold kitchen. The heart is not a house with one room. Grief lives in one of them forever. And you can build new rooms your whole life if you're brave enough to keep the furnace running. Sometimes, on the coldest nights, Ethan reaches over in the dark and takes my hand, and I think about that January morning and the truck in the driveway, and the one thing he said that I'll never forget. Nobody should be this cold, least of all you. He was right, and I'm not anymore. So tell me, what would you have done if your late spouse's sibling showed up to fix something in your home during your worst season and then said something that felt more like a confession than a repair? Would you have sent them away to keep the peace, or would you have let yourself be warm again? And have you ever found something a person you lost left behind, a note, a gift, an unfinished project, at the exact moment you needed their permission to keep living? Tell me your story in the comments. And if this one warmed you up, leave a like, subscribe, and I'll see you in the next video.